Well, welcome back to week number 2 of What Not to Wear. If you missed last week, would encourage you can go back and check it out on our YouTube channel. It's just Level 13 Church. If you go to YouTube there and you can subscribe, so you can check it out and keep up with everything that's going on here. All the sermons that we've done in the past you can find there, at least over the last few weeks. But this series isn't so much about the television show that was on TLC back in the early 2000s, even though it was an awesome show. I loved it. Haley and I watched it all the time. It was great. It's not so much about the show. It's about us learning what we don't need to wear and instead what we need to put on in place of some things. Last week, we kicked things off by saying this show, the concept was pretty simple. There were men and women who were in drastic need of an intervention when it came to their clothing. They had no idea how to dress themselves, and it was bad. It was really bad. And so these two fashion stylists, they would show up unannounced and they would just stage an intervention, for lack of a better word. They would tell these men and women, essentially, you have no idea how to put clothes on the right way. You need all the help that we can offer you. And so these men and women who were so unsuspecting and had no clue that they didn't know how to dress themselves, they were invited to New York. They had to bring all of their clothes with them. They hung them all up on racks, and they had to pick out 3 or 4 of their most comfortable pieces of clothing, and they would go inside this 360-degree mirrored room. And they waited, and they looked around, and they saw every angle that you could imagine. And I think all of us in the room this morning, that's like one of our greatest fears, right? To have everything about us exposed. None of us would sign up to do that. We wouldn't want to say, hey, yeah, I'll do that. No, we wouldn't. None of us are that desperate for attention that we want 360-degree mirrors all around us at all times. It was just crazy. So not only did they have to face that, but they had to face those fashion designers telling them, this is wrong. This doesn't look right. This is bad. The thing that struck me the most about the show wasn't the fact that these people didn't know how to dress themselves. It was the fact that they were just completely lacking self-awareness. They were so comfortable with the way things were that they didn't recognize that there was anything wrong. And that statement, so comfortable with the way things were that they had no clue anything was wrong, that transcends clothing. It goes far beyond that. It reaches into a lot of areas of our lives. And for those of us who are followers of Jesus, the area that this is most evident is just in the way that we live day to day. We talked a lot last week about 2 men, a guy named John and a guy named Paul, who they told us essentially, we don't need to live the way that we used to live. When we came to follow Jesus, when we said yes to Jesus, our old way of life needed to be put off so that we could put on this new life. In fact, Paul was so bold, he said it like this in Ephesians 4:22 through 24. This was a letter he wrote to the church in Ephesus. He says, put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires. You need to be made new in the attitude of your minds and put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. You need to put off the old you and put on the new you. And that's kind of where we left it last week. We left a little bit of a tension there. We left a little bit of an unresolved conflict there. How do we practically begin the process of putting off our old self and putting on the new? That was the question that we were left with. That's the question that we're left with this morning. How do we practically begin the process of putting off our old self and putting on the new? We have our marching orders. We have the big goal in mind. But how do we start? How do we begin? Where do we go from here? Well, that's a question that we're going to do our best to answer this morning, but I want to make sure that I say something on the very front here, that I say something from the very beginning that is going to dispel a little bit of confusion around this whole idea of putting off the old self and putting on the new. See, in the world that we live in, we think, for whatever reason, that putting off our old self is a one-time event. That, you know what, I just wake up one day and I've said yes to Jesus and I'm done with the old self. And I can just check that box off. That's what we think. That's what we want to think. That's what would be easiest. But that isn't what's true. It's a process. We could say it this way. Putting off the old man is not a one-time event. It is a process that we go through and that word, I wanted to just put that as large as I possibly could on the screen. I wanted to make it huge, mature. As we mature in our relationship with Jesus. This is a daily decision. We don't say yes to Jesus one time and then move on and like we're done. We wake up every day and say yes to Jesus. I'm going to follow you today. I'm going to pursue you today. I'm going after you with all of my heart, Jesus, today. If we're living in a place where we've only said yes to Jesus once upon a time, way back when, and we cried a few tears at camp, that was an awesome experience. But saying yes to Jesus is a daily decision that we must make. So, this daily decision that we're supposed to make, how do we begin that process? This seems really difficult. If we wanted to use a churchy word here, we could say this is called sanctification. It's a gradual process. It's going to take place over time as we grow and mature. How do we start? We will do that. Like, hey, I'm for it. I want to do this. I want to just walk in this way. I want to have this experience. But how do I start that process? Well, before we look so much at what we need to take off, I want us to look this morning at some things we need to put on. Because for the men and women who showed up to the shows, What Not to Wear, they had to throw all of their old clothing into a trash can. But once they did that, they had to go and get something new because they couldn't walk around unclothed. And neither can we. So if we're only focusing on things to take off and we're not putting some things back on, then we're going to walk around unclothed, and before we know it, we're going to go dumpster diving back in the trash can, and we're going to pull up those comfortable things that we used to wear. It's not our intention, but that's what's going to happen. So, good news for us this morning is we don't have to wonder what we need to put on first. That guy Paul we talked about a lot last week, and I mentioned earlier, he actually gives us some information. He says, here's the thing you need to put on first when it comes to getting rid of the old you and putting on this new you. Here's what you need to add first. In a letter to a group of Jesus followers in Colossae, it was a city, people who loved Jesus, and they needed some instruction, they needed some direction, they needed to know how they were supposed to live this whole Jesus life. He wrote a letter. And in his letter, he gives the first thing that we need to add. But before he does that, he lists about 15 things that we need to take off and put on. So how do we know which one to start with? Well, give me just a minute. We're going to get there. I'm going to read. I didn't put all of this up there. I would encourage you to go back and read Colossians chapter 3 later this afternoon. That can be some homework for you. But I want to read through just a little bit of this. He says this in Colossians 3, verse 1. Since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. He's continuing to hammer home this point. Put off and put on. Take off and put on. You've died to your old life. You need to put on the new life. He just continues to hammer this through. He says, put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to the earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, greed. Because of these things, God's wrath is coming. And then he says this, you used to walk in these things in the life that you once lived. Like that's the way that you used to be. That's the stuff that's easy to continue to wear. That's the stuff that has made us comfortable. But now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy language from your lips. Don't lie to each other. Since you've taken off your old self, there's our words again, with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another. And if anyone has a grievance with anyone, forgive them as the Lord forgave you. We read through that text, we read through that part of Paul's letter to the Colossians, and it can be overwhelming. Like, okay, Paul, I thought you were going to give us one thing, and you gave us such a laundry list of stuff. It's easy to see how we could revert back to the old way. It's easy to see how we could just give in to what was comfortable and what felt good. What's the one thing? Where do I start? Well, in verse 14, he says this, above all of these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Above everything else, put on love. So there's the answer. That's what we put on first, is love. But what is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Couldn't resist. It was just low-hanging fruit. Had to do it. What is love? Paul, what exactly are you talking about? I mean, this love that you mention, are we just walking around, gushing everywhere, just hugging every person that we see? I mean, is that what we're talking about? Or maybe, Paul, the kind of love that you're talking about is when we just allow everyone to have their truth, and we support it, and we encourage it, and we sign off on it. Maybe that's the kind of love you're talking about, Paul. Or maybe, Paul, I know you didn't see this coming, but maybe it's a 1960s Woodstock kind of love that was just love for everybody, and man, it was free and flowy, and it was awesome. Maybe that's the kind of love that you're talking about, Paul. Well, I think if he were here this morning, he would say, the kind of love that I'm talking about, it is what should define us as followers of Jesus. It should be our first response. It should be the first thing that people notice about who we are. But what is it? What is it? What is it? We'd continue to press him. Well, he wrote about it in another letter to another church. And it's something that all of us are familiar with. We've heard it at weddings. We've read it and saw it up in art galleries or in Hobby Lobby. If we've gone there and looked at places, we've seen excerpts from there. Hobby Lobby is the closest art gallery that I go to. Just bear with me, okay? That's a stretch, I know, but there's art there. You could call it a gallery. That's what I'm saying anyway. But he wrote this in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. He says, love is patient. It's kind. It doesn't envy. It doesn't boast. Love's not proud. It doesn't dishonor others. It's not self-seeking. It isn't easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. if we wanted to just boil it down to the simplest form, what is Paul saying when he says put on love? He says that as followers of Jesus, we should be known for a radical love for our God and for those created in his image. We should be putting on a radical, passionate, life-giving love for God the Creator and for those created in his image. Simply put, putting on love demands that we view everyone through the lens of love that God views us through. Let's think about it for a minute. We were enemies of God, separated by sin, going our own way. We were walking down a path that led to a real place called hell. And Jesus met us. Jesus met us. And he didn't look at us as enemies. He looked at us as sons and daughters who hadn't been introduced to the family yet. And we're called to look at everyone we see, every person that was created in the image of God. And oh, by the way, here's just in case you were wondering, every person with breath in their lung was created in the image of God. Every person. It doesn't matter who they are, where they're from, what they look like, what their ethnicity is. Every person was created in the image of God. And so every person we see, we should see through the lens of love that God views us through. I mean, after all, Jesus himself said that. In John's account of the life and teachings of Jesus, he quotes Jesus in John chapter 13, verse 34, by saying this, "A new command I give you, love one another." And then he adds a qualifier. He doesn't just say, hey, love one another and figure it out. He says, as I have loved you, love one another. When I think about the way Jesus has loved me, when I think about the way Jesus has pursued me, when I think about the way Jesus has forgiven me, if my calling is to put on love and love others the way he loves me, that's got to be my go-to response. That has to be the way that I move naturally. That has to be my go-to interaction with everyone that I meet is love. Now, I've told this several times. One of my favorite communicators in the world is Andy Stanley. I had a chance to hear him speak 4 different times earlier this week, and it was a blast. Some of the information I'd heard him say before, some of it was brand new. It was just awesome stuff. But he made a statement that I had heard before that was centered around this whole idea of loving one another, and I thought it was brilliant. I wanted to share it this morning. Here's what he said. Christ's selfless love for me requires I do what's best for thee. It's easy to remember. It's easy to understand. And as much as I like Andy Stanley, I'm going to disagree with him there. Just a little bit. I think everything that's written there is true. But I think if we only look at this statement through the current cultural context that we live in, through the way society tells us to look at things, then what this means to me and what this means to you, if we only use that lens, is, man, I just need to love and accept everyone. Their truth that's right for them is okay. I can approve of every personality, every lifestyle, every vice, every agenda. If I'm going to love the way that Jesus loved, and if Christ's selfless love for me requires I do what's best for thee, well, whatever's best for that person, then I need to love and accept. If we look at it through the lens of our current cultural climate, then that's exactly what we're going to believe and think. But that's not what we learn from the message of Jesus. That's not what we learn from the life of Jesus. Yes, Jesus hung out with tax collectors and sinners. Yes, Jesus told the woman who was caught in the very act of adultery, I don't condemn you. Yes, he accepted and welcomed them just as they were. But he loved them enough to tell them, go and sin no more. See, we live in a world where there's this misconception about love. That love means that I just blanket check mark everything that you're doing. And I love you, so I love everything that you're doing, and I'm okay with it all. That's not love. And can I just be real for a minute? If our relationships are built on that kind of love, we don't have authentic relationships. They're not. I know that's not popular to say. But if our relationships are built on, hey, I love this person, so I accept everything about them. I love this person, and so everything they do is cool. I love this person, so everything that they believe it's okay because that's what's best for them. That's not an authentic relationship. That's a relationship that's built on, I'm just going to call it what it is, fake. It's fake. There's a sentiment in our world, in church world. Come to our church where it's okay to not be okay. I get it. I understand the thought process behind it. But that's only a half-truth. If we're going to put on love, then we need to continue the conversation like this. Come to our church where it's okay to not be okay, but it's not okay to stay that way. It's not okay to stay that way. Yeah, you're welcome. Come. I want you here. It's okay to not be okay. It's okay to be broken. It's okay to be messed up. It's okay to have some issues and some struggles and some problems. That's fine. We're not looking for perfect people. But we're also not looking for people who are going to continue to not be okay and just think that that's okay. When Jesus had a meal at Matthew's home with all these tax collectors and sinners, some of the religious leaders of the day, they came around and they said, how could this guy who's supposed to be this religious leader be eating with such, and this was their words, such irreputable sinners, such worthless garbage? And Jesus didn't take those religious leaders and say, hey, come over here to the corner, let me whisper something in your ear. He said right there out in the open, he said, I didn't come for the healthy, I came for the sick. He called the tax collectors and sinners sitting at the table with Matthew around him as he's having a meal. He's, hey, you're sick. There's something jacked up about you. There's something wrong. There's something broken. The woman who was caught in the act of adultery, when all of the other men who wanted to stone her to death dropped their stones and they walked away, Jesus looked up and he said, where are your accusers? And she said, there are none, Lord. He said, I'm not accusing you either. Now go and leave your life of sin. See, it isn't enough just to love someone and accept them in and bring them close. Sometimes love requires us to do something a little bit more difficult than that. Love requires us, true love, the love that Jesus has had for us, that Jesus has for us, requires us to have a hard conversation sometimes. Isn't that what he did with us? He didn't just show up on our path as we were headed to a real place called hell and say, hey, mind if I tag along? Like, I'm not going to hell with you, but I'll walk as you head there. Just because I want to let you know I love you. I'll just walk beside you. But then when you get ready to step off into that abyss, hate to be you. He walked on that journey with us. But then he pointed out the stuff in our lives that needed to be healed. He said, hey, there's sin here. This is separating you from me. This is causing a gap in our relationship, and I love you too much to not call it out. Not in a way of hatred or anger or condemnation or I'm better than you. To call it out in a way of love. Because I want this relationship to be all that it's supposed to be. To quote Andy Stanley again, he asks a question to help frame this. To put on love. Here's what he says. What does love require of me? What does love require of me? And the beautiful thing and the frustrating thing about this question is that there is no blanket answer. It's going to differ in every single situation and circumstance and relationship that we find ourselves in. In some instances, love may require that I lend out my strength rather than point out the weakness in the other person. In another instance, love may require of me to have that awkward conversation that I've been dancing around because I didn't want to bring pain to the relationship. I didn't want to cause hurt in the relationship. And so I've skated around it and we've just pretended like that giant elephant in the room wasn't there. And oh no, it's not an elephant. It's just something. And we didn't talk about it. Maybe love will require me to be generous to someone in need without knowing what the result is. In every situation we find ourselves in. What does love require of me? It may require something different. And as great as this question is, and as much of a filter as this question can be for us, this isn't the end either. See, I love Andy. But I think he stopped just a little bit short here too. Because any of us can sit around and ask, well, what does love require of me? And we can get all philosophic about it. We can have committees meet about deciding what love is going to require of me. We can debate it until we're blue in the face. We can talk about it on social media. We can create a hashtag. We can put t-shirts. What does love require of me? And we can have this whole campaign and it would be beautiful and awesome. But it doesn't stop here. See, putting on love doesn't just require me to ask, what does love require of me? It goes a step further. Then I have to go and do it. It's wrestling to the ground. What does love require of me in this moment? And then going and doing it. You and I can't put on love simply by talking about it any more than we can get dressed for work in the morning simply by saying, you know what, I need to get dressed. We have to get ourselves up out of the bed. We have to put our clothes on and start the process. We actually have to get engaged and involved in the process. Putting on love is exactly the same way. We can ask that question all day long. What does love require of me? Love requires this of me. Now I'm going to get up and do it. Love requires that I die to myself. Love requires that I die to the way I thought I was loving. Because it isn't love if it's only halfway there. Love doesn't go halfway, it's all in. And love's dirty, and it's messy, and it hurts, but it's worth it. Love is welcoming, but love is also not afraid to call sin, sin. Not from a place of judgment, not from a place of, hey, I know better than you, I'm better than you. It's from a place of genuine concern for the soul of that person. The great magician duo, Penn and Teller. The voice of the duo. It's a well-known atheist, outspoken atheist. He's quoted as saying, "How can you believe that you have the answers to eternal life, to escape a place called hell of destruction? How can you claim to have that information and not share it with everyone? That's not love. That's hate. How much do you have to hate someone not to tell them that?" My fear is that the world that we live in right now has become so inclusive and so accepting that everything goes, just throw it all in a big pot and stir it all together, and whatever comes out is okay. That those of us who are followers of Jesus, we've gotten to a place where we're not wearing love the way that Jesus wore love. Yes, he accepted everyone. Yes, he loved everyone. But he also called sin, sin. He was also willing to have those hard conversations. He was also willing to say, hey, leave the life that you lived behind you and come experience new life. Come and follow me. And as his church, as his body, as men and women who represent him, we must do the same. This is hard. Because the reality is this, every one of us in the room, there's a picture of somebody in our heads right now that we think about. Maybe I haven't done what love's required of me in that relationship, in that situation with that person. Or we're thinking about someone who we genuinely love. We have great care and concern for that person, but we've given ourselves permission not to go there because we don't want to risk losing the relationship. I'm going to say this with as much love as I can. If that's what's holding us back from going there, we've already lost the relationship. It's a relationship that's built not on truth, not on love, but on falsehood. Heath, that's hard stuff. Yeah, it is. The invitation to come and follow Jesus isn't an invitation to come to easy. It's an invitation to come and die. And I've yet to meet a person who said, hey, dying is a piece of cake. Most all of us go kicking and screaming. But in this instance, dying is worth it because it allows us to truly come alive. Let me pray for us. Dear Jesus, putting on love, such a simple thought, such a simple concept in theory. God, when we get to looking at the nuts and bolts of it, when we get to looking at the reality of it, it isn't easy. It's painful. It hurts. It's hard. And it requires so much of us. God, all of us have friendships. We have relationships with lots of different people, some who are followers of Jesus, some who are not. And so the thoughts of moving forward and having those difficult conversations, that's scary. And I get that. Would you give us boldness to put on love? And even when it's hard, even when it's difficult, even when it hurts, even when we don't know the outcome, would you give us the boldness to follow through? Not simply ask the question, what does love require of me? But then to put some legs behind it and go and do it. Holy Spirit, would you begin to do a work in each of our hearts? And God, would you start with me this morning? Open my eyes to see what love will require of me, and then give me the strength to go and do it. Lord, I pray that's our prayer this morning in Jesus' name. Amen. Would you stand as the band plays and sings? Final song. If you need prayer for anything, you just want to spend some time connecting with God, you want to wrestle with this, I want to invite you to the front. There'll be some folks who will come and love to pray with you. If you want to pray where you're at, that's fine too. I just want you to know that this is open. This front place is open. We would love to pray with you this morning.